Welcome back to A Good Length. I'm Dr. Vinubamidi. Today we're going into the heart of one of the most misunderstood conversations of our time. Gender roles, the provider myth, and the quiet shame that lives on both sides of the line that we've drawn between men and women. Between traditional breadwinners and caregivers. Between what we choose and what we're told we're supposed to want. This episode is going to rattle a few cages, no doubt. Let me start by painting a picture of two of my male friends who are currently struggling. The first is a married man of 12 years with two great kids. I'll call him Steve. He works 60-hour weeks in a job that he stopped loving years ago. But he makes a lot of money, so he sees it as a means to an end, a necessary sacrifice for the long-term security of his family. His wife is a trained architect. She's funny, she's brilliant, extremely capable, and incredibly intelligent. And also earns a very healthy salary herself. But when their first child was born, they made a decision together, no one forced the other, and that decision was that she would drop down to part-time work and spend 3 days a week at home with the children. And he would bear the brunt of the financial load. And Steve didn't resent that decision because he chose it and owned it. But what's currently quietly destroying him today is the invisibility of that sacrifice. Because no one asks him how he's going. No one says, that must be exhausting. What he gets instead is this. You're so lucky that your wife is at home with the kids and you get to continue your career. Lucky. Lucky to carry the financial weight. Lucky to absorb the pressure. Lucky to trade fulfillment of spending time with his children for the responsibility of providing for them without acknowledgement. And now I want to talk about my other friend. We'll call him John. A similar situation. Two highly intelligent adults, but this time after careful deliberation, the couple makes a choice that John stays at home. Because his partner has the more impressive career and far higher earning potential. John becomes the primary caregiver to their 3 children and does a little bit of casual work here and there, mainly from home. And he's fantastic as a primary caregiver. He's present, he's engaged, he's invested, he knows the children's routines, their fears, their friendships. But at every barbecue, at every school pickup, at every family Christmas, he gets asked the same question. So, are you looking for regular work? Because underneath all of it sits the age-old assumption that a man must earn to justify his place. So we have 2 different men, 2 different choices, but with the same wound. One is unseen, while the other is quietly judged. We continue to convince ourselves that we believe in choice and equality, but we still don't know how to respect men outside a very narrow frame. Because if a man provides, protects, and sacrifices the joy of spending time with his children, we take it for granted and we ignore the cost. And if he doesn't do that, we question his worth. And that's the contradiction, the tension, and the wound that many men live with. Because we live in a society that celebrates the dismantling of rigid gender roles for women, all while still holding men to a fixed, silent contract. To provide, to protect, to be stoic, to endure and not to complain. And as a man, if you step outside of that, you better be prepared to explain yourself. So until we learn to see men in all of the ways they show up for their families and honor their sacrifice, we'll keep creating men who feel invisible, no matter which path they choose. So in essence, we've created a system where one gender is expanding its identity, while the other is still being measured against a legacy template. That's not equality, that's asymmetry and insincerity. Our societal framing of gender has now extended beyond fairness its double standards. And until we're willing to question the expectations placed on men with the same intensity that we've questioned those that have been historically placed on women, this tension isn't going anywhere. When a man devotes himself obsessively to his career, he is often branded as selfish, arrogant, greedy. neglectful. And I experienced this firsthand. And I have to honestly accept some of that criticism. Because there is no doubt that my dedication to my career and drive to secure long-term financial freedom for our family placed a significant load on my ex-wife and demanded sacrifices from her. I would be ignorant if I didn't acknowledge her sacrifice in that respect. But in the end, I was penalized for being a provider while she was rewarded for being the caregiver. Financially rewarded, sure, but also relationally rewarded by being allowed majority custody and to move to the other side of the country, despite the absence of any risk factors on my end. Yet, when a woman does the same, as I did, and dedicates herself to a high-powered career, she is celebrated as empowered, independent, liberated, and admirable. So which is it? Either the standard is the standard, and we judge the same behavior the same way in both men and women, or we acknowledge that men and women are different, with different strengths, different biologies, trade-offs, priorities, and we stop selectively invoking equality when it only flatters one side. But we must pick one. You cannot demand equal praise, offer unequal criticism, and then call it justice. But first, let's frame the argument that we're discussing. And this topic gets triggering very quickly because people hear gender roles and they immediately assume you're either defending the 1950s or attacking them. But that's not what we're doing here today. So straight off the bat, the proposition of this episode is this. Traditional gender roles, where a man chooses to be a primary breadwinner or a woman chooses to be the primary caregiver, are actually not inherently harmful in themselves. The harm does not live in the choice. The harm lives in the assumption and the automatic default that says that men must be providers, and that this designation is non-negotiable, never questioned, and comes without emotional acknowledgement. Let me put it another way. A man who freely chooses to be the primary financial provider for his family, fully informed, fully supported, and fully seen in that role, he's seen as living an honourable life. But a man who's choosing to stay home and raise his children is being shamed and failed by his culture. And a man who has been quietly conscripted into the provider role without anyone ever asking what he actually wanted, that man is carrying a weight we don't even have the language for yet. The real question isn't whether traditional roles should exist, because it is my belief that traditional roles can absolutely exist and do so peacefully, consciously, and without resentment. But only when they're chosen by both parties, clearly communicated and agreed upon, not imposed, and that most importantly, there is a commitment to review this arrangement periodically with open minds and a spirit of compromise. My mistake in my marriage was that I failed to recognize the critical importance of that periodic review. And I've spoken to many women in my life to date about this to try and understand the female perspective. And what I will say, without doubt, is this. There are many women today who quietly and often privately would genuinely love the opportunity to be more present at home to raise their children and invest deeply in family life. Not because they lack ambition, but because their ambition is expressed differently. Yet, that choice doesn't always feel as socially safe as it should. Because alongside the necessary and overdue dismantling of restrictive roles, we've created a new kind of pressure for women, a pressure to prove independence, to demonstrate career ambition, and to avoid being seen as less than. So while we are freeing women from the "you must stay home" expectation, we seem to have in some ways replaced it with a different "you should not want to stay at home" expectation. Because true progress isn't about steering women away from traditional roles, it's about making every path, whether that's career-focused, family-focused, or a blend of both, equally valid, equally respected, and equally free of judgment and shame. Because replacing one rigid expectation with another isn't progress, it's just a different kind of conformity. And I want to bring in something that Jordan Peterson has talked about extensively. And I'll reference his work here, not because I agree with everything that he says, but because on this particular point, he identifies something real. In his book, 12 Rules for Life, Peterson argues that the demand for responsibility is one of the deepest needs that men have, not just a societal imposition. And that same demand for responsibility is the intrinsic draw towards meaning through provision and protection. Men who feel called to provide, that's a noble path. Men who feel called to nurture and raise children as their primary role, that is equally noble. Men who want to build something new, a blended, non-traditional arrangement that works for their actual family, equally valid. What is not valid and what is actually damaging is telling any of those men that one path makes them a real man and that the others don't. And to understand why we're stuck, we need to understand the historical architecture of that provider role. And this is the kind of history that explains why your grandfather never talked about his feelings and why your father might have apologized for needing help. For most of human history, the division of labor between men and women was not ideological, it was practical. Pre-industrial societies were organized around physical capacity, childbearing biology, and survival. Men did the work that required sustained physical output away from the home, and women did the work that required proximity to young children and the domestic space. Sure, this wasn't equality, but it also wasn't purely oppression, it was adaptation. The sociologist Talcott Parsons, writing in the mid-20th century, formalized what he called instrumental and expressive roles. Men as the instrumental actors, being task-oriented, outward-facing, and economically productive, and women as the expressive actors, emotionally attuned, inward-facing, and relationally sustaining. Now, Parsons wasn't celebrating this division so much as describing what he observed in post-war American society. Somewhere around the 1950s, 60s, you had the perfect cultural storm. Cheap housing, the rise of single-income households as an aspirational ideal, and mass media telling everyone that a good man earns and a good woman keeps the home. The 1950s breadwinner model was a post-war construction that lasted roughly 25 years before economics changed, before social norms changed. The feminist movement opened up new possibilities for women. But the emotional and psychological expectation on men to provide, that their worth is tied to their earning capacity, that failure to do so is a fundamental masculine failure, that expectation survived and continued almost intact. In essence, we changed what women were allowed to do, but we didn't change what men were required to be. A landmark study published in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior in 2010 examined how social roles affect health across the life course. And one of their central findings was that role expectations, particularly those tied to breadwinning for men, created what they described as a chronic role strain, when men felt unable to meet those expectations. Chronic role strain is a very specific kind of stress. Not the acute stress of a difficult day, but the grinding, low-level, persistent stress of feeling like you are permanently falling short of who you're supposed to be. And this kind of stress is significantly correlated with depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease, and critically, with men's profound reluctance to seek help. Research by Levant and colleagues published in Psychology of Men and Masculinity has consistently demonstrated that adherence to traditional masculine norms, and specifically to the norm of self-reliance and the provider identity, that predicts a lower likelihood of seeking medical or psychological help. So what does that mean in plain language? Men who feel their identity is wrapped up in being the provider and the strong one, men who feel they must not show weakness, are less likely to go to a doctor when they're sick. They're less likely to see a therapist when they're struggling. Less likely to tell anyone what's actually going on. And before anyone interprets this as men are weak, let me be very clear. This is not a character flaw. This is a rational response to cultural messaging that has told men consistently and from childhood that needing help is failure. And the courage it takes to push through that messaging is extraordinary, and at times seems insurmountable. But the cost of not pushing through is literally killing men. A really interesting study by Doucet in 2016, published in the journal Fathering, examined the experiences of primary caregiver fathers across multiple countries. What Doucet found was consistent and striking. Men who chose to be the primary at-home parent reported high levels of social stigma, isolation from male peer networks, condescension from healthcare and schooling institutions, and a profound lack of social infrastructure to support their role. In other words, stay-at-home fathers were making a legitimate, considered, and often highly functional choice for their families, and yet being penalized socially for it. The men in Doucet's study weren't struggling with their choice, they were struggling with other people's responses to their choice. Interestingly, Doucet also found that men who stayed at home reported higher satisfaction with the role when they had social support, when they had other stay-at-home dads, when their partner was affirming, when their extended family respected that arrangement. And that support made all the difference. The stigma was the enemy, not the role itself. And work by Kramer Kelly and McCulloch, published in the Journal of Marriage and Family in 2015, examined what happens to men's psychological well-being when their breadwinner status is challenged through unemployment, a partner's promotion, or a voluntary role reversal. The findings were nuanced and important. Men who had a strong internal breadwinner identity, who genuinely believed that providing financially was core to who they were as men, those men experienced significant psychological distress when that identity was disrupted. But men who held their provider role more lightly, who saw it as just one contribution amongst many, rather than as the defining face of their masculinity, those men showed resilience and flexibility when their economic role changed. The takeaway here is not that breadwinner identity is bad. It's that when any one single identity becomes the entire architecture of a person's self-worth, that person is fragile and vulnerable. And as we have built a culture that tells men that breadwinner identity is everything, the fragility is the natural consequence of that. A comprehensive meta-analysis published in Psychology of Women Quarterly in 2011 examined the relationship between gender role attitudes and the relationship satisfaction. Crucially, they found that couples who had explicit, mutually agreed upon arrangements, regardless of whether those arrangements were traditional or non-traditional, reported higher relationship satisfaction than couples where the arrangement was implicitly assumed or imposed. And this is a profound finding. It tells us that it is not what you choose that determines relationship quality. It is whether you chose it consciously, together, and with full awareness of the costs and contributions involved. A traditional arrangement, when freely chosen and mutually honored, is as healthy as any arrangement. And an arrangement that was never discussed, never negotiated, and never acknowledged, that is where resentment grows. And these arrangements cannot be set in stone once and assumed to be in place indefinitely. I learnt that the hard way. And it is crucial that these arrangements need to be reviewed periodically with a spirit of compromise, partnership, and without judgment. If that's not the case, the relationship is on unstable ground. There is also a lot of talk, and rightly so, about the doubt and shame that stay-at-home mothers have sometimes felt about their own choice. Usually because other women have loudly criticized women who chose the home, that they were somehow choosing less and deserved more. That narrative has been rightly challenged, and we've made progress on that. But we don't ever talk about when a similar, equivalent shame lands on men. For example, the breadwinner man who loses his job and cannot tell his wife for 3 weeks because he doesn't know how to say, "I failed at the one thing that I was supposed to do." Or the stay-at-home dad who gets asked at school pickup with barely concealed astonishment whether he's babysitting today. Or the man who earns less than his partner and doesn't know why he feels vaguely ashamed of it, even though he's never consciously believed that his income defined his value. Or the father who takes 6 weeks of parental leave and gets jokes from colleagues about being on holiday. Now, these are not catastrophic moments, they are small ones, but they do slowly accumulate and they form a sediment that over the years, that sediment hardens into silence. A learnt inability to talk about what the role actually costs. Because a culture has told men that talking about cost in itself is a form of weakness. On the other side of the ledger, there is also shame that lands on women who choose traditional roles. Women who are highly educated, capable, ambitious, by any standard, the exact kind of woman that the feminist movement fought for, and those who have chosen freely and happily to step back from their careers to raise their children, and who receive from the culture around them, usually from other women, a subtle message, or sometimes not so subtle message, that they have somehow betrayed something. But you have a degree. Don't you feel like you are wasting yourself? What about your identity outside the home? As if the home is not a place where identity can flourish. As if raising children is not work that requires every skill a human being possesses. As if the choice to center one's life around family is a diminishment of self rather than a deliberate act of love. And that right there is the failure on both sides of the political conversation. The conservative failure is to assume that the traditional roles are natural and inevitable, and the refusal to see men and women being harmed by being conscripted into those roles without choice. And the progressive failure is to celebrate and encourage non-traditional arrangements so exclusively that people who genuinely want traditional roles feel ashamed of saying so. So neither side is really serving society. Let's talk about what's happening right now in the manosphere conversation, because it's playing out in real time on platforms where millions of young men are forming their views about what it means to be a man. Andrew Tate, you knew his name was going to come up eventually. Tate has built an enormous audience of predominantly young men on a platform of aggressive masculinity that centers the provider and protector role as the definition of manhood. His message, stripped of his performance, bravado, and provocation, is essentially this: men are for earning, women are for being looked after, and anything that deviates from this is weakness or degeneracy. And this is doing real damage to young men. Not the part where Tate advocates for men to work hard, that's an honourable message. But the part where Tate ties a young man's entire sense of masculine worth to a very specific, very rigid script, and implies that any deviation makes them any less of a man. That is a cage and a sentence, not a compass or a map. But here's what's also true, and this requires intellectual honesty. Tate would not have the audience that he has if there were not a genuine identity vacuum currently, if young men weren't searching for something. Because the reality is that young men feel disoriented. They feel like the old traditional scripts have been taken away and no one has offered them anything real in replacement. And into that vacuum, Tate walks in with a certainty and a swagger that is in some ways breathtaking when viewed through the eyes of a directionless young man. And for many young men, certainty, even wrong certainty, feels better than the constant ambient confusion they're living in. Humans make irrational and poor decisions when they are hungry. The answer is not to ignore the hunger, but to offer something better. Something that has the same clarity and directness, but that actually serves men rather than weaponizing their insecurity to wage an all-out gender war. On the other end of the spectrum, you have voices like Brené Brown, whose research on shame and vulnerability has been enormously valuable. Talking about vulnerability as strength, about the courage it takes to be seen. Brown's work is important, but her primary audience has been women. And her cultural uptake has largely been in spaces that don't always reach the men who most need to hear it. And between Tate and Brown, there's a middle ground, a space that is where I'm hoping this podcast lands and can be joined by many more voices and content to come. Now, I want to get practical for a few minutes because upon reflecting on my failed marriage and the part that I played in it, I want to talk about what genuine choice for men and for women actually requires. What conditions need to be in place for a decision to be truly free rather than coerced by social or partner expectations? And after spending a lot of time reflecting on my own failed relationship, I managed to boil this question down to 5 conditions that I believe are necessary for role freedom to genuinely exist without resentment. Number 1, the conversation has to explicitly happen and be documented in some way and be willingly endorsed by both parties. For a role division to be freely chosen, it has to be explicitly discussed, not assumed, not defaulted into because it's what your parents did, and not fallen into because no one felt brave enough to raise the question. How many couples have actually sat down and said, what do we each want? What are we each willing to give? What would we each find meaningful? What does provision mean to us? What does nurture look like for our family? That conversation is not as common as you'd think, and its absence is where resentment is born. I certainly wasn't aware enough to have that conversation intentionally or frequently as my ex-wife and I moved through those stages of our lives. The seasons changed, but I was not able to see that enough to recognize that the conversation needed to be had again. So if you are in a relationship right now and you haven't had this conversation, please sit down and have it. If for nothing else, then out of courtesy and curiosity. Ask your partner, without judgment and a willingness to genuinely understand before being understood, what would our ideal life look like? What roles would each of us play and why? What's the cost? And who carries it? And is it fair? The second is that both choices have to be genuinely respected. Genuine freedom requires the decision to be a breadwinner and the decision to be a caregiver are both held with equal respect by both partners. Not a grudging tolerance, not a hidden contempt, but genuine equal respect. That means that the breadwinning man does not look at his stay-at-home partner and feel like he is supporting a passenger. And the stay-at-home partner does not look at the breadwinning man and feel like he is absent from the family's real life. Each role is full. Each role is valuable. Each role is a contribution to something larger than itself. And if one of you secretly believes that your role is more important, this will come out over time. And it will come out sideways, in resentment, in contempt, in the slow erosion of intimacy, and eventually in the breakdown of the relationship. So please, do the work now to genuinely honor what your partner is doing, whatever that is. Thirdly, the costs have to be acknowledged because every role has a cost. The breadwinner gives up time and freedom and often a measure of presence with the family. And the stay-at-home parent gives up career momentum, financial independence, and adult stimulation. All of these sacrifices are real losses, and they all deserve acknowledgement. One of the most corrosive patterns in relationships is what I'd call the invisible cost, where one partner carries a burden that the other simply doesn't see. The man who works 60 hours a week is often doing so in a state of invisible exhaustion that nobody names. The woman who manages the household and the children full-time is often doing so with a level of cognitive and emotional labor that is rarely quantified. So if I had my own time again, I would name the cost, say out loud I know this is hard for you. I know what you're giving, and I want you to know that I see it. And that sentence, said sincerely and regularly, is worth more than any structural arrangement in the world. Learn from my mistakes. Acknowledge your partner's sacrifices. Number 4 is that there should always be room for the arrangement to be renegotiated. As I mentioned just before, seasons change, people change, circumstances change. What felt right at 30 might feel constraining at 40. The arrangement that made sense with young children might not serve the family once those children are teenagers. A genuinely chosen life is not one that was decided once and never revisited. It's where both partners maintain the ongoing ability and permission to say, I think I need something different. Can we please talk about that? Without that ongoing renegotiability, every choice is really just a prison with a nice origin story. And number 5 is that the choice should not be contaminated by shame. And this is probably the most important one, and the hardest to assess, because shame is often invisible, even to the person carrying it. Are you choosing to be the breadwinner because you genuinely find meaning and satisfaction in providing financially for your family? Or are you choosing it because the alternative, which is being at home and not earning, feels unappealing? Are you choosing to stay at home because you genuinely want to center your life around raising your children? Or are you choosing it because the idea of working 40, 50 hours a week doesn't appeal to you in the slightest? And I want to speak directly to the men who are carrying the financial weight for their family, who are working sometimes in jobs they no longer love, sometimes in conditions that take a physical and psychological toll because their family needs it. To those men, I want to say, you are doing something honorable, something real, and something that matters. And I want you to hear this next few lines very carefully. You are allowed to say it's hard. You're allowed to feel the weight of it. You're allowed to have days where you wonder whether you would have made different choices if anyone had ever asked you what you actually wanted. You are allowed to mourn the time with your kids that you're not getting, the hobbies that got set aside, the version of yourself that existed before the mortgage. You're allowed to feel the responsibility of managing all the expenses. Acknowledging those costs does not make you ungrateful. It does not make you weak, and it certainly does not mean that you are failing at your role. It means that you are honest. And honest men are actually what we need. The narrative that men who provide should simply be grateful, should be able to absorb any amount of sacrifice in silence because that's what men do, that narrative is not strength. It's a trap. And the men that I know who have been in that trap the longest are the ones who eventually break the hardest. Midlife crises, affairs, alcoholism, depression that's been building for 20 years. These are not failures of character, they are the consequences of a silence that was never sustainable. So if you are that man, if you are carrying the financial weight and nobody has ever asked you how that feels, I recommend that you ask yourself, how is it? What's it costing you? Who knows the truth of it? Find one person, a friend, a therapist, your partner, anyone, and tell them the truth, not the performance. Because telling the truth is not weakness. That is, in fact, one of the bravest things a man can do. And now I want to speak to the men who have chosen to step back from the traditional provider role and are the primary caregivers, who are at home with their children, who have sacrificed career advancement to be present for their family in a different way. You are doing something that requires enormous courage in the current culture. Not just because the role itself is hard, but because you are doing it in a world that has not built the scaffolding for you. There are no playgroups designed with a stay-at-home dad in mind. And the institutional language of healthcare and education still defaults to mothers. Your male peer network has probably not given you the language or the permission to talk about what your days are really like. And yet, there you are, showing up and doing the work, raising human beings. Let me say this as clearly as I can. The work of raising children is amongst the most complex, demanding, and consequential work that human beings do. It requires emotional intelligence, patience, self-sacrifice, creativity, physical endurance, strategic thinking, and an ability to hold another person's entire developmental trajectory in mind across thousands of mundane interactions. It is not less than professional work. In many ways, it is more. The man who knows his children's teachers by name, who tracks their emotional developments, who shows up for their fears and their triumphs, who shapes the human beings that they're becoming, that man is doing something the world will feel for generations. Even if no one at the family or neighborhood barbecue knows how to acknowledge it. I want to talk about what happens inside relationships when this conversation isn't happening, because the data on that is quite sobering. When couples haven't explicitly negotiated their role expectations, when they've defaulted into arrangements that were never consciously chosen, resentment tends to build on both sides. The Gottman Institute research has consistently shown that the equality of the meta conversation in a relationship, and that is, conversations about the relationship itself, about roles and expectations and fairness, those conversations are the strongest predictor of long-term relationship health. The couples who don't have these conversations aren't saving themselves from conflict, they're just deferring it. And deferred conflict in relationships tends to have compound interest. Here's a pattern I've observed clinically and personally. A couple enters a traditional arrangement with the man as a primary breadwinner and the woman as a primary caregiver without having explicitly chosen it. Over time, the breadwinning man feels increasingly invisible and taken for granted. He's working hard, sacrificing much, and no one is saying thank you. The stay-at-home partner, meanwhile, feels increasingly isolated and undervalued. She's working hard, sacrificing much, and no one, including her partner, seems to recognize it as work. Both are right. Both are suffering. Both are invisible to each other. And neither knows how to say it. Because saying, "I feel unseen in this arrangement," feels like a criticism of the arrangement itself. And neither wants to blow up the life they've built. Until someone gets to their wit's end and does exactly that. A nuclear end. The fix is not to change the arrangement, the fix is to see each other within it, to name the cost, to express the gratitude, to make the invisible visible. And it requires the kind of honesty and emotional courage that this whole episode has been building towards. The reason this conversation matters beyond our own lives is for the generation that we are raising right now. Our sons and daughters are watching everything that we do. My sons are now 11 and 13. They're consuming hours upon hours of content every week, watching how people talk about work, watching how their father is being treated, watching how their father reacts, watching how he approaches his life and his duty, how he contributes to domestic labor, how he treats his new partner. The young boys are watching what we say and don't say about our own desires and our own exhaustion. They are forming their own maps for what men do and what women do, and what choices look like, based entirely on the evidence in front of them. If your son watches you work a job that you hate in silence, never complaining, never acknowledging that it costs you, he will learn that stoic suffering is what men do. And in time, he will naturally gravitate towards the same patterns or behaviors. After all, humans are just an evolved animal. And as they say, monkey see, monkey do. And if a daughter watches her mother manage the entirety of domestic life without recognition or thanks, she will either accept the same for herself or swing so far in the opposite direction that she refuses any domestic contribution whatsoever. Neither is freedom or conducive for society. If young boys see mothers keeping children away from their father, they will come to expect the same behavior in women as they become adults. And that becomes a recipe for resentment and anti-female propaganda, where the young men will either actively avoid starting a family or making a commitment for the fear of being treated the same way, or they come to see this as the new norm. And so the cycle of uncommunicated expectations leading to premeditated resentment continues into the next generation, and the gender war rages on. What we want to give our children is something different. We want to give them the sight of two adults making deliberate choices, of conversations happening out loud, of roles being acknowledged and honoured, of people saying in front of their children, I chose this because it matters to me. And I see what you choose and it matters too. We want our sons to know that providing financially is honourable, but also that nurturing children is equally honourable, and that neither is more masculine than the other. We want our daughters to know that a career is a legitimate life, and that a family-centred life is equally legitimate. And the choice between them is not a political statement, but a personal one. We want to raise a generation that asks for what they actually want, not what they're supposed to want. A generation that builds relationships around explicit, conscious, mutual agreements rather than inherited defaults. A generation that can say, this costs me without feeling shame. And this means everything to me without apology. That generation requires us, as the adults right now, to do the work first. One of the things I keep coming back to in this conversation is the word contribution. What does a man contribute? For most of our cultural history, the answer has been a man contributes economically. His provision is his value. But this was always poor accounting. Men have always contributed more than money. They've contributed protection, be it psychological, physical, social protection. Men have contributed presence, the anchor of reliability and the steady witness. Men have contributed wisdom, accumulated through experience and passed on to children. Men have contributed the kind of modelling that only comes from being truly known by the people you love over time. And none of those contributions require a particular economic configuration. A stay-at-home father can protect, be present, offer wisdom, and model character. And a breadwinning man can do all of those things as well, if he's not so consumed by the role that he has nothing left to give. The question is not whether a man provides money or provides care. The question is whether he is fully present in whatever form his contribution takes to the people who need him. Whether he's showing up as himself in his actual life with his actual choices, without hiding behind the role or being crushed by it. That is what masculine contribution looks like at its best. Not a function, but an intentional, regular, and genuine presence. David Gilmour, the anthropologist, has authored a book called Manhood in the Making, a cross-cultural study of what different societies have required of their men. What he found is both humbling and liberating. Virtually every human culture has asked men to be generous, to protect, and to be procreative in a broad sense. Generative, contributing, building something that outlasts them. But the specific form of that contribution has varied enormously across cultures. There is no single script for being a man. There is only the commitment to contribution. And the form that contribution takes is ultimately yours to define. As I close out this episode, I reflect on the men I admire the most, the ones who seem genuinely at peace with who they are, regardless of whether they provide financially or care for the children at home, regardless of how their arrangement looks like to the world. And they all share one thing. They know why they are where they are, they chose it, they examined it, and recommitted to it. There's no performance in it, no apology. There is just a man in his actual life doing something that is genuinely his. If this episode has unsettled something in you, if you're listening and thinking, I'm not sure I ever actually chose this, then I want you to sit with that discomfort. Don't run from it. And don't immediately reassure yourself that everything is fine. Let the question do its work. Because the discomfort of honest self-examination is temporary. But the cost of living an unexamined life is not. If you are that man, the one carrying a load that was never named, questioned, or fully chosen, this is your invitation to begin the self-examination. Not to blow anything up or abandon your responsibilities, but to look at your life with clear eyes and ask, is this mine? Did I choose it? Do I want to keep choosing it? And if the answers are yes, then carry it freely, proudly, and without apology. And if the answers are complicated, then start the conversation with yourself and your partner, or with a friend who can hold the weight of it, or with a professional if you need one. If you are a younger man in your 20s and 30s still building the architecture of your life, you have something that is rare and irreplaceable, and that is time and optionality. Don't squander it by defaulting. Build the life you want deliberately. Have the conversations before they become necessary. Choose the role, whatever it may be, because it fits you, not because it's what's expected. Because the truth is this: the men who live well are not the men who live perfectly. They are the men who live honestly, who know the cost and carry it knowingly, and who know the gift and receive it gratefully, and who can say at the end of a long day or a long life that what they did was theirs. This is what we have to ask of ourselves as men today. Not perfection or performance, but honesty and presence. The willingness to ask the hard questions and sit with whatever then surfaces. Thank you for showing up for this conversation today and sitting through the complexity of it. If the episode resonated with you, please comment, subscribe, share it with someone. Hopefully the man or men who need to hear it will find it. And as always, thank you for bearing with me. I'm Dr. Vinu Bamidi. Until next time.